in your own time.
Okay. The Egyptians were very familiar with ostriches. As creatures of the desert, both to the east and the west of the Nile, they were considered suitable subjects for hunting. That in Egyptian tomb scenes, where we see the tomb owner going off on hunting expeditions, it's reasonably often ostriches which are being chased. It was only really in the New Kingdom that the Egyptians were able to hunt ostriches successfully, because by then they had something that could keep up with the ostriches in terms of speed, which was of course the chariot. Ostriches, like this fellow here, can get up to 30 miles an hour, so it was quite clear that hunting these things on foot was not really a very possible option. The Egyptians were interested in hunting ostriches for sport, but also for things that they could get from them. And the main thing that the Egyptians wanted from ostriches was the same thing that Victorian milliners wanted, which were their feathers. But rather than being used for hats, as is the case in our own relatively recent history, these feathers were used primarily to decorate important objects, particularly the chariots, of which were used in order to hunt the ostriches themselves, and of course which were also used in battle. If you look at scenes of Ramesses II going into battle on the walls of his temples, we can see that his chariot and his horses are decorated with ostrich feather plumes. To my mind, the best object which represents this relationship between hunting and chariots and ostriches comes from the tomb of Tutankhamun. From that tomb, there's a fantastic ostrich feather fan. Now, the ostrich feathers themselves are now sadly gone, but on the body of the fan itself, it's two-sided. And on one side, you can see Tutankhamun himself going out in a chariot, setting off to hunt ostriches. On the reverse, it's the return from the hunt, and you can see Tutankhamun's chariot coming back with the bodies, and his retainers are shown carrying the body of a dead ostrich. So that connection between hunting, between getting hold of ostrich products, and the valiant hunting of these swift creatures in the desert are all intermingled. But where does that leave the ostrich egg? Because, of course, an ostrich egg is a very immobile object. Unlike the feathers, it's not attached to the ostrich itself, which can be chased around and obtained from dead ostriches. What you need to get hold of ostriches is to find nests and get hold of them. And that, of course, is a significantly less visually or exciting sport as hunting the ostriches themselves. Nonetheless, we do sometimes see some tomb scenes of people coming back from the desert hunt carrying ostrich eggs. More to the point, we also see desert dwellers shown bringing ostrich eggs to the king. The most important scene that shows this comes from Amarna. The celebrations of year 12 of Akhenaten, where in theory all the different subjects of the empire came to Amarna bringing typical products of their particular regions. Now, most places which came within the sphere of the Egyptian empire could bring some really fantastic products in. You can see Nubians bringing exotic African animals and gold. You can see Syrians bringing elaborate manufactured goods. But what about the people to the west of Egypt, the people who lived beyond the oases, people who, for general shorthand, we refer to as the Libyans? What can they bring to show the power of the king who can command them and their resources? What they're shown bringing are ostrich feathers and ostrich eggs. Basically because these are people who don't have, as far as we can tell, a high level of technological ability or raw materials to draw on to offer splendid things to the king. So when it comes to the migration of goods and the migration of high quality, high status artifacts, the people who live to the west don't really have very much to provide compared to the other areas that the Egyptians are interested in. But we do know that ostrich eggs are going through Egypt. Some of them stick in Egypt. Not many, admittedly, because the Egyptians really didn't seem to know what to do with these things. The shell itself of the egg could be used for a whole variety of different things. When these things were originally produced, as it were, they would have been much whiter than we can see here, and they made fantastic raw material for beads and small trinkets, and these are often found. The eggs themselves, not so much. The example that I'm holding here, which comes from the site of Cahoon, is a rare example. And this seems to have been used as part of, well, we're not quite sure what it's been used of, either some ritual vessel or some ritual object. It once had a green wooden handle or spout attached to it. But as I say, this is a rare exception to the rule that Egyptians weren't really interested in ostrich eggs. But they could be exported. We know this because across the Eastern Mediterranean, there are a whole range of places where ostrich eggs have turned up that you'd find quite surprising. Now, I said earlier that we've got these two species of ostrich. Those in North Africa, which clearly are the source for ostrich eggs coming into Egypt, and then we've got the Syrian ostrich, which can be which is the source for eggs which turn up in Mesopotamia. But we also get eggs turning up on mainland Greece, and in the Greek islands, and on Cyprus. Now, where are they coming from? Because we know that there weren't any indigenous ostriches in those places. And what seems to be happening is that ostrich eggs were an important part of the trading that's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean that I talked about earlier. So where do we find these ostrich eggs, and what do they look like when they turn up in Greece and in Cyprus? Well, primarily we find them in tombs, and we find them in temples, in ritual locations. They don't often appear as ordinary undecorated eggs like the one we see here. When they arrive, people do extraordinary things with them. In Cyprus, they give them simple geometric decoration. But in the Aegean and on Greece, they do fantastic things with them. They stick glazed dolphins on them. They put bands of copper and gold. They provide elaborate silver mouths to these things. They turn them into vessels, into writer. And these are used as presumably really exotic objects, which often, when they're found in temples, have some sort of cult usage. But I think more than anything, I think these are items of great exoticism, which are then dressed up using local customs and local techniques in order to turn them into a strange hybrid, a strange mixture between something that's imported and something that's local. Think about it this way. Imagine you'd never seen an ostrich or never knew about an ostrich, and suddenly you're presented with this. It's obviously an egg, but it's an egg unlike anything you've ever seen. Now, that in itself is going to be extraordinary. You know, the tales that could be told about the sort of creature that this came from, well, they're not preserved, but one can imagine the sort of extraordinary stories that might be told. And the object itself, unlike a chicken's egg or a duck's egg, can be turned into things. The shell itself is quite robust. It's 2 millimeters thick. It takes significant effort to actually get into this thing. So, as an object of exoticism, which is being transported, migrated across the Eastern Mediterranean, you can see it has this real exotic appeal to it. So, how does the egg travel? How do these eggs move around the Eastern Mediterranean? It needs to be admitted from the outset that these aren't mainstream trade. The things that are being moved around the Eastern Mediterranean in large numbers are things which have a real value to them. So the classic thing that we've got here is copper. Copper, and to a lesser but nonetheless important extent, things like olive oil and wine, resin, are moving around the Eastern Mediterranean on ships in very large quantities. How do we know this? We know this for a number of different reasons, but perhaps the most startling reason that we know this are finds of shipwrecks. There's one particularly important shipwreck off the southern coast of Turkey called the Uluburun wreck. That was a ship that was primarily transporting large quantities of copper. It was also transporting large quantities of olive oil and resin. Where it was going to and where it was going from, we're not quite certain. But we know that Cyprus was an important copper producing place at the time, and it may well be that the ship was possibly on its way to Egypt via mainland Greece and Crete. Among the cargo of the Uluburun wreck were a couple of ostrich eggs. Now, what this indicates is that they're not part of an important bulk trade, but perhaps these are the trinkets which were transported around the Eastern Mediterranean, not as part of an official, institution to institution, government to government trade like the copper, but something which is on a much smaller scale. And I'm tempted to think that these are the sort of things which would be part of individual small-scale trade, either by odd gifts which are put on these ships for ruler to ruler, or more likely, I think, perhaps, the things which sailors, traders are picking up as they make their way round the Eastern Mediterranean, either to take home as a souvenir, either to take home as something to sell, or just as a curiosity. It's, of course, very common, and we know this is something that goes on to the present day. Sailors travelling around the world, picking up exotic items, and them finding their way into private collections or as gifts when they come home. And I think that's what's happening with these ostrich eggs. I think they're part of a transmission and migration of objects, which is taking place on the level not of governmental trade, but as part of the transmission of objects by individuals acting as agency, carrying these things round. And again, it's tempting to go further than that and think of these things as possibly the basis for just the sort of stories that can be woven around exotic objects which simply don't exist in the place where they're dropped off. So again, it's tempting to speculate that along with the objects themselves, sailors who pick these things up in North Africa, in Egypt, who may well have been aware of the existence of birds like this that produce things like this, could have told really quite extraordinary stories about where these things came from. In the same way that something like a narwhal's horn can be taken out of context, taken to a medieval court and explained as being a unicorn. So on. It's that same idea of transmission, not just of objects, but the transmission of ideas around those objects, which can create their own legend, which can create their own set of stories. So ostrich eggs are really quite important, I think, not as objects which are themselves are of intrinsic value, but as a marker for things moving their way around the Eastern Mediterranean in a way which is sometimes difficult to pick up through other types of object. Olive oil and wine are consumed, even if the containers that are transported in aren't. Copper, of course, is consumed. Unless you've got things like the Uluburun shipwreck, you're not going to find the ingots in which they're transported because, of course, they're intended to be used, to be turned into copper bronze objects, to be remelted, turned into other objects, and, if we're lucky, survive in the archaeological record perhaps in a quite different form to where they were originally envisaged. But the ostrich egg, you can dress it up, you can add things to it, but you can't really turn it into something which is so divorced from its basic egg-like shape. And of course, why would you? Why would you when you've got something which is such an extraordinary object and such an important and interesting marker, not just of the transmission of objects, the migration of objects, or indeed the migration of peoples, when you've got people like these Libyans that I was talking about earlier, the ostrich egg as a marker for them moving eastwards into Egypt, a time when we begin to find other finds of ostrich eggs, particularly on the North Mediterranean coast. It's a marker of the movement of peoples. But I think the movement of ostrich eggs, the migration of ostrich eggs, of course not under their own steam, but carried by other people, is an important marker of both the movement of objects and the things that people are capable of when they're migrating, when they're moving across land, and more particularly around the possibilities of the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course the ideas that go with it as well. And as I've been able to make clear, the sort of places that we find ostrich eggs and the sort of uses to which they're put fit very well within this idea of an evolving narrative, an evolving set of ideas, which can be attached to these objects and which can give them a definitive and distinctly different identity wherever they end up and however they're used in places which would never have seen the bird which produced them in the first place.
One